do it to you?
She did it once.
She got it again. And then she broke her finger again.
Nice.
Look at that.
Ladies, welcome. We're going to go ahead and start. I think there's going to be a few more people joining us later on. We're really excited to be able to offer this to our non-public schools. I'm Ann Schmidt, and I'm the Director of Special Ed for Perry. And this is Renee Aziz, and she is going to be presenting for us today. So we're really excited about this opportunity and hope that you take a lot with you after you leave this morning. Okay? Did everyone sign in the back? Okay. If we could go around and just everyone introduce themselves, because I don't know if everyone knows everyone.
I don't know you, I'm sorry.
So if we could just go
Okay,
around.
I'm Kathy Boyle. I'm from St. Mark's School, and I'm a middle school social studies teacher.
Evelyn Carosa, Special Ed, St. Mark's School.
I'm Ann Kinney, kindergarten, St. Mark's School.
Jan Miners, resource teacher, Calvary Lutheran School.
Diane Doe, resource room at Southwood Crest.
And Debbie Perkins, I'm the principal at St. Barnabas.
Carrie McGrath, resource at St. Barnabas.
I'm Linda Thompson. I'm the teacher interventionist for the non-public school.
I'm Hannah Williams. I'm a private school teacher of record.
Sherry Woodman, I'm a special education teacher at St. Jude.
Susan Hancock, Title I teacher at St. Mark, St. Jude, Calvary Lutheran, and St. Rock.
I'm Hannah Will. I'm the principal at Gray Road Christian School.
Pat Musgrave, special needs coordinator at Roncalli High School.
Kelly Fisher, I'm the school social worker at Roncalli. Debbie Goddard, secondary language arts teacher at Calvary Christian School.
I'm Rainey Pickering, 4th grade at Calvary Christian School.
Thank you, that helped me. Ann has lots of things in her agenda, so questions for Ann, because she's going to be popping in and out before we get started. Okay, thanks Ann, we'll see you when you get back. Good morning everybody, I am Renee, as Ann said, and I'm glad to be with you this morning. Tell you a little bit about me and how I got to you today. I actually used to work in the district as a school psychologist. And so I tested many of the students from some of your schools. I had some elementaries as well as some high schools, so I may have tested, as I said, some of your students. But I was a psychologist in the district for several years before I left and started working for the State Department of Ed. And my role with the state was to go around the state of Indiana and train teachers and educational leaders about tiered systems. We've all heard that word, right? RTI, that's code word, RTI. So that was my job. I, traveled from the top of Indiana all the way to the bottom, and what a fun time that was. In that traveling, although it's very rewarding, I had little ones at home and a husband that didn't want me on the road so much. So I did that for about 4 years, and then just started my own consulting business. And so I work with Perry. Perry is one of the school districts that I consult with, and I'm actually here in Perry quite often, maybe like 2 times a week. And my role here is to really support the district in learning more about culturally responsive instruction and positive behavior support. So as we have been working in Perry, one of the things that we've tried really hard to build is more knowledge around tiered systems. Because if we're talking about culturally responsive instruction, which just means how do we provide instruction that's meaningful to all of our students, one of the ways we have to think about approaching that is to make sure that we're catching students' difficulties at the first sign of that difficulty, which is what RTI is all about. So when we think about RTI, we'll talk about this in the PowerPoint, but one of the essential components of RTI is this problem-solving component. How do we get together with our colleagues to talk about the needs of a student and come up with an action plan to support those needs? And that's what we'll be learning about today. What we've done in Perry is train all of our buildings, K through 12, on a specific problem-solving process. When I was working with the state, we also trained problem-solving, and we really trained just elementaries. because for a long time, problem solving and kind of what we used to call GEI teams, that's not in our state language anymore, so I won't use that word, but GEI teams is what we're referring to. GEI teams were really a creature of elementary, and it got harder to do that at middle and high school. So at the state, there wasn't much support for middle and high schools. But in Perry, in other districts that I consult with, what I've really noticed is we really have to start thinking about ways to take that concept and make it meaningful for secondary schools, because the need is still there. So we'll talk about a structure that can support you even if you're a middle school or high school educator as well, okay? So, is that what you thought you were here to learn about? Okay, all right. Well, today, again, I put the PowerPoints back there and a couple handouts for you, so grab those if you haven't already. But today, what we're going to be learning about is a specific way, a teaming process that we can come together, as I said, with our colleagues and use a 5-step problem-solving process to identify the students' needs and kind of prioritize those needs, because lots of times when we come together as a team, there are lots of needs and we can't address them all. So how do we prioritize those needs? And when we think about RTI is really based on data, data-based problem solving. So we'll prioritize those needs by using data. And from utilization of that data, we will be able to monitor how a student responds to the interventions that we put in place. And then, we'll be able to revise our action plans to better meet that student's needs. So what I'll teach you today are the kind of logistics of those 5 steps in the problem-solving process. One thing I do want to just say up front is I realize that some of you may or may not even have a team at your school. This might be kind of an informal and informational session to know, okay, what are the expectations here? How do we make this work? And if that is your situation, just listen attentively and try to think about and make connections with how this might look in your school. And let's have a conversation about that. So I don't mind at any time if you say, all right, my school doesn't have but 1 teacher per grade level. How is this going to work? So let's make sure that we have those conversations. And I think you guys as colleagues can really share with each other about the best way to get this up and running, okay? So here's this infamous triangle that everybody's seen and probably sick of seeing. But tell me real quick what you think of. Good morning, come on in. We've got some PowerPoints back there for you. Tell me what you think about when you see this triangle. What are the essential things that pop out, stand out when you see the triangle like that? Anything? How many of you have been to some kind of RTI workshop? Yeah, I used to do those at the state. They're exciting, huh? Anybody? What have you heard? Yeah.
The first thing I think of is catch them in the green.
Catch them in the green. What's the green?
Well, the first tier, the first step.
Right. The green is the first tier. The first tier represents what we do for who? Everybody, right? Tier 1 is universal. This is what we're doing for all of our students. And so do we want most of our students to be in the green? Yeah, that's a good sign, right? So we want 80 to 90% of our students to be successful with what we do for all of our students, right? So then in the yellow, what's the yellow represent? What have you heard? Got some clues up here. Who are we talking about in the yellow?
Students that are identified at risk.
Right, they're at risk. So from some data, we know they're not successful here. They're at risk. Were you going to say something?
They would benefit from small group instruction.
Right. So when we're thinking about these students at risk, we got to think about how do we target their needs. And the best way to target needs for students at risk is to provide that small group instruction. Exactly right. Now at the top of the tier, we call that tier 3, and we're talking about the students in our schools with the most intense needs. So they're not in the green. We know from data that they're at risk. We try some small group interventions. Student does not respond to those interventions. What do? Is this, who makes up this? I said intense needs, but is that special ed? You should
The middle group?
No, the top group.
Oh, the top group?
Yep.
They could be, but maybe not.
Could be, but maybe not. That's the right answer. High five on that one. Absolutely.
It's a safe answer too.
Is that what that was? I think they always get it right, but now I'm going to start second guessing that. Actually, as I said, exactly right. They could be special ed students, but not necessarily. When I recall working, as I said, as a school psych and getting a student who, let's say, was identified. Let's say that I was working with a student with autism. Well, I can recall this one student who's a 4th grade student who can read fluently. And I mean, when I say fluently, faster than I can read, right? Just could read any book, right? Did he need support with reading fluency? No, he was in the green. Now he could read fluently, but not always comprehend everything he read, and some of that was because he was a fast reader and was missing some context clues. The other part was that he didn't have knowledge of certain content or context because of his disability. So we provided small group support for comprehension, right? So in related to reading comprehension, the student could fall in the yellow. But social skills, very intense needs. He was a tier 3 student with that, right? So that's an example of how a special ed student could fall across all the tiers. Let me give you an example of a non-identified student. Again, working in elementary school, tragedy. Students, one of the students lost a parent in an accident. This had been a student who was an average student, B, C student. Really was pretty much in the green in terms of test scores and benchmarks. No real behavior problems prior to the accident, but once that happened, in a state of grief and not really able to function well at school. So a student who had typically been in the green was now a student who would come to school and just not be able to function. Couldn't do work, couldn't attend to any of the things the teacher was saying, needed some very intense support for that time period, right? So that was a student that wasn't all of a sudden ED, right? But had some intense needs that we had to figure out how to support, how to partner with our mental health folks from the community to support that student, all right? So tier 3 does not have to be special ed. When we look at this triangle, we can break it down, as I said, according to 3 essential components. Now that triangle that we just saw with the green, the yellow, and the red, think about each of these essential components and break them up into the green, the yellow, and the red. You will need to make sure that in your school you have the capacity to think about green, yellow, and red across all of these essential components. And these are curriculum, instruction, and intervention, assessment, and database decision making. So when we talk about curriculum, when we talk about the green tier 1 layer of the curriculum, what we're talking about is the core curriculum. What is it that we provide for all students? So if I'm at Ron Colley and I'm a 10th grader, what's my core curriculum in English? What's my core curriculum in math, in science? Right? And then we're going to be looking at the data to make sure that the majority of the 10th graders are performing, when I say majority, again, 89% are performing in the green, right? Because if they're not, that means that it's not necessarily a function of what's going on with the students, but it may be our instruction that we need to adjust to meet the needs of our students. So in the yellow, in this essential component, we start to think about supplemental support. Student is now clearly at risk. We know that from our data. What are those things that we're going to supplement the core curriculum with to meet the student's needs? We don't give up the core curriculum. We add to it. Think of it as a double dip. Okay? How do we embed small group instruction, right? How do we provide supports that are specifically targeted to what that student needs, right? So if I am a math student, I'm struggling in math, I'm at risk in math, my core curriculum might be everyday math, but I'm not responding to that, right? So you got to figure out what are the supplemental supports that you can put in place for me around math. That might be some small group instruction on my basic math facts. That could be some small group instruction on problem solving if that's my area of need. All right, so we're doing things in addition to the core. Intensive interventions, again, it's adding on to what you're doing to make sure that you're meeting the student's needs. So maybe those small groups, 3 to 5 students, still are not supporting that student's needs. How do we get even more intensive? Sometimes that's one-on-one. Sometimes that's one-on-two, right? When we talk about increasing intensity, we're talking about frequency, duration, and focus. So as you move up the tier, this is kind of going down, but think about that first triangle. As you move up the tier and you try to intensify, you got to intensify by frequency. How often are you doing it? Duration, for how long are you doing it? And your focus, what are you working on? So if I'm intensifying in math, I'm not teaching multiple components of math, but as I intensify, my focus becomes more narrow. So multiplication. Right? Let's jump to the assessment essential component. I really think that, maybe it's because I'm a school psych, but I think that the assessment piece is the most critical essential component for RTI. Without the right assessments, it's hard to know who's at risk. And it's even harder to problem solve and think about what to do. So we'll talk about assessment a lot as we go throughout our morning. But when we think about, again, those 3 tiers of assessment, we have to have some assessments that we give to all of our students, right? What are some of those assessments you give to every single student in your building?
Foresight, NWEA.
NWEA, grades 3 through up. I.D.E.A.L, right? Anything else you give? Maybe you...
Regular quizzes and tests.
Quizzes and tests. Yep.
Assignments.
Right, those are ways to assess students. One of the things in RTI that's a critical feature is being able to kind of determine the nature of your assessments. I have been given the opportunity, as I have shared with you, to visit lots of schools. And we assess kids a lot. But I'm not sure we are always assessing the right thing. And that's a struggle for me. And what I try to support people in reflecting on is there are different types of assessments. We've got summative assessments and formative assessments. Anybody heard those words before? Yeah? Summative assessments, think of them just how they sound. A summary of a student's performance or learning. So summative assessments like NWEA, I.D.E.A.L, quizzes, those are all assessing what a student has learned after we've taught it. Gives us a summary of their knowledge. But if this process is to work, and this is where our state is going, it's not just Perry Township that's trying to give you all this information. You know, you've been to workshops. If we are to be able to implement RTI effectively, we've got to think about that additional type of assessment, formative assessment. And formative assessments, think of it as informing your instruction. So now I'm giving assessments that I can look at that data and know whether or not the student has is responding to how I'm teaching or how I'm intervening. The thing about formative assessments is that they're more frequent in nature and they're typically isolated to specific skills. So instead of giving the NWEA and looking at language arts, a formative assessment might look at a student's fluency or might look at a student's comprehension. So as we go throughout the day, I really want you, and we'll have some time to really kind of break out and think about our assessments, but this is key, that we build formative assessments into your assessment toolbox, I kind of call it. You need summative and formative. You need both. They're both important pieces of information, but this process cannot work if you don't have those formative assessments, okay? And just back to the tiers real quick, when we think about universal screenings, we need to think about our summative, but as we go to tier 2 and tier 3, that's when we start using more of our formative assessments to help us diagnostically pinpoint what is the student's area of need. So I know he's struggling in reading because his summative assessments tell me he's not passing I.D.E.A.L, right? His chapter tests, he's failing them. I know he's weak in reading. What is it about reading? If I'm an elementary student, is it that I can't read fluently? And if I can't read fluently, why? Right? So we need these kinds of assessments that can tell us about the sub-skills related to reading that we need to support that student with. Progress monitoring assessments sound just like what they're called. They monitor a student's progress toward skill attainment. Now, database decision making. This is going to be our focus today. Just like the other essential components, you got to have multiple layers of database decision making or problem solving in your school. I'm sure all of you have school improvement teams, right? There's a team that comes together to look at school-wide data and make decisions about what the school's area of focus might be. Some of you might even have grade level or content area teams, right, that meet as often as they can to talk about their specific grade level or specific content area. But what we are going to focus on is how do we embed building level intervention teams in this tiered system of database decision making. Now, for a long time, we think back to GEI. GEI often was the only real problem-solving mechanism that we had in our schools. And to be honest, they weren't even, I'm not even sure if I'd call them problem-solving, because really they were just the gateway to special ed. So, yeah, GEI, yeah, well, let's do that. We got to fill out that paperwork before we can send it over to Perry to get the student tested. Okay? That's not where we're coming from these days. When we talk about building intervention teams, we really mean how do we get together collegially to figure out what's going on with that student and put in an action plan, right? And monitor that student's response, okay? So today, as I said, we're going to be talking about 5 specific steps to support that building intervention team. I call it the I.D.E.A.L process. And it's kind of a play on words, I always say, because of course we all want the most ideal things to implement in our school. But the reason why I like I.D.E.A.L is that it's an acronym for the phases of the problem-solving process. So the first phase, the I, is to identify the problem. What's going on with that student? The D is defining and analyzing that problem using data. So a teacher might say, Johnny is having problems with social studies. Well, now you've got to look at all the data that you have about Johnny and figure out where do we start? How do we prioritize what we're going to do for Johnny? The third step is to explore intervention options. Now that we know what's going on and where we need to start working, what are some options for interventions that we can put in place? The fourth step is to then act or implement your action plan with fidelity. That's something we'll come back to, but fidelity there is the key word. We can say, here's our action plan, go and do it. But if we don't do that with consistency, not really what we need. And that is has huge implications. Huge implications for now our special ed process, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. We've got to make sure that we implement these action plans with fidelity and consistency. The last step then is to come back together and look at the results. Do some follow-up. We've implemented this plan. How is the student responding? And then based on the data, we determine what our next steps are. So what we're gonna do today is just take each of these steps and talk about what it looks like, what are the things you do in each of those steps. I'll give you some resources, ask me questions. So that's gonna be this is gonna be our main focus for today. A couple other things before we get to the first step. I mentioned there needs to be multiple levels of problem solving, right? Your school improvement teams, your grade level teams, in addition to your building intervention team. Here's just another visual of that. Comes from Iowa, who really have been the leaders in our country around this problem solving process. They've been doing it for decades now. In fact, in Iowa, they don't even have labels. Like, you wouldn't find a student that's labeled LD or autistic or emotionally disabled. You don't find that. You instead find levels of service that they need. There are no labels. So they've really mastered this concept of problem solving. And what they do is they talk about problem solving across two variables: the amount of services or resources needed to support that student, and how intense the problem is. So, according to the amount of resources and the intensity, as we go up both of those variables, as both of those variables increase, the nature of our problem solving gets more focused. So down here at the teacher level, we would be doing things here that are not very intense and probably the teacher can handle in her classroom. Teachers do that every single day. They're masters at teacher level problem solving. Student doesn't bring their homework for a week, teacher problem solves. What do? What would a teacher do in that situation? Calling home. I saw the phone sign. I saw it. They call home. Hey, I'm having trouble with homework. Is something going on this week? You guys have been busy with extracurricular activities. What's going on? Just need some support. Not going to shoot it to the building intervention team at that point, right? The problem is not intense enough to necessitate that level of problem solving. But let's say the problem seems to be affecting more than just one student. Let's say let's say I'm in the 3rd grade and I'm the principal. Every time I'm in the hallway and it's time for lunch for the 3rd grade level, the hallway is noisy. Like, it is just ridiculously noisy. As a principal, I might be wondering, what is going on with the 3rd grade? Lots of noise there. There's something going on about behavior at lunchtime with that grade level. It's affecting more than one student, which makes that problem a little more intense. And it's going to require more resources than just one teacher because it's across classes, right? That might be when we need some grade level, or if you're in high school, content area problem solving. Whenever you see a problem affecting more than one student, and the problem is similar in nature, you can get together with your grade level or content area colleagues and talk about what then will we do as a team to address this issue. So if we've got a noise problem in 3rd grade at lunch, what can we do to teach our students about transition to lunch, or expectations about hallway behavior? How can we all, as a 3rd grade, communicate that message to our students? That might be level of problem solving there. Building level, again, that's where we're going to be focusing on today. So after teachers have gone through these couple of layers of problem solving and the problem still is not resolved. Let's say there's one student in that behavior example that they really are a mess all the time with their behavior. So as a third grade team, we've tried to put in interventions, we've retaught expectations. There's one student that still is having significant behavior problems. That student might be the student then that we refer on to our building level intervention team to help us develop an action plan for that one student. Right? Now that problem is more intense, and it requires more resources because I've tried things already. I need more resources to help give me some ideas about what to do for that student. The last layer that they talk about in Iowa is a district level problem solving team. So let's say out of this building level team, you've put in really good interventions, you've done that with consistency over time, student just does not respond. You've revised your action plan, you tried lots of things, you've monitored progress, and nothing. That might be when you want to, and you call Hannah up and say, Hannah or Linda, any suggestions about behavior, right? You're going outside of your school and bringing in some district support to help you. It could be at this point where you're talking about case conference committees and figuring out how to develop an IEP for a student who's been tested, right? When you think about district level, you're calling in outside folks to help support you with that student. It could be back to my example of the student who had that tragedy with losing a parent. So it could be connecting with mental health organizations to help support that student too, all right? Again, my point here, and the reason why I've spent some time talking about these layers of problem solving is because I can probably say with about 85%, that 85% of the time, the main issue that I notice schools have, well, second, the main is really assessment, but the second is that they don't have multiple layers of problem solving. This building intervention team becomes their only resource for problem solving. And what happens when they're the only level is that they don't have the capacity. There's too many students that come to that team and they can't handle all the requests. And that happens when you don't have these lower levels of problem solving really structured and working effectively, right? So, the role of the building level team is really to serve as a team of colleagues, right? So we're not talking about one person that you go to and say, hey, I'm having trouble with this student, right? We're talking about a team here. And as an aside, when I first started working with the district, Perry had no building intervention team, none. And actually what happened was that it just made me think we had a person, it was typically our special ed teacher, that we would go to and say, I'm having trouble with this student. And then that teacher, that special ed teacher, would then try to give us some ideas, but also at the same time say, well, try this and give these papers to the parents to fill out for testing. That's just the reality. So I'm saying that to say that we've kind of, we're in a state of transition, that's not even acceptable anymore, but it hasn't been too long ago that those things have been in place. And that's important to recognize because you very well may have some colleagues in your school that have that mindset. They're like, teams, bring it to a team. I'm not doing that, just give me the paper. So I say that jokingly, but we've got some teachers who are veteran teachers, really good teachers, but aren't necessarily fully aware of how we need to change in our practices. So you're a team of colleagues that, again, are getting together to come up with an action plan to meet that student's needs. That student at risk. You're going to support the teacher to develop focused, research-based interventions. I know you've heard that 1,000 times. You're like, where are they? Where are they at? We'll talk about them. You're going to use those research-based interventions to develop a plan for that student and then be purposeful about monitoring the student's response to those interventions. So we got to collect data. We're going to use that data to then determine the most appropriate next steps. When we finally did come up with teams in Perry, and I happened to be lucky to sit on my school's team, we'd have our meetings and the teacher, we'd come up with interventions, teacher would go back and implement, and then we'd come back together and we'd say, how did the plan go? Oh, it went good. Johnny is really, he's raising his hand a little more in class, so I think he's doing better. Teacher anecdotally reported that Johnny was raising his hand more before he had not been participating, so he's raising his hand more. Well, that's a great sign, but we're going to use more than just anecdotal, subjective things now for this process. We've got to have those things, which are important.